Hello everyone and welcome to this Headspring webinar on organizational ambidexterity. My name is Desiree, I'm your digital marketing specialist here at Headspring and I'm also your moderator today. We want this webinar to be interactive, so please send in your questions during the masterclass for a Q&A towards the end. You can do this by clicking on the somewhat discreet question mark on your right-hand side. We will also have some multiple choice polls throughout the webinar. I'm excited to introduce my presenters today and to welcome back one of them, Marieluise Maiwald, who is a learning and development consultant, as well as a Headspring faculty member and coach. Hi, hello.
Hello.
How are you today?
Yes, well, thank you. Hi, Desiree.
I am also here with Ian Turner, who is a consultant in executive development and management learning. Hello, Ian. It's great to have you here.
Hi, Desiree. Great to be with you.
Okay, so I'm not going to hold anything back now, so let's just kick off.
Very good. Thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here with Marieluise. So, ambidexterity, long word, and it's been with us actually as a concept for some time, for at least 50 years. But I think in the last 5 to 10 years, it's certainly achieved a prominence. And part of that, I think, is to do with this this big thing that all organizations, all industries seem to be affected with at the moment, which is disruption. And so if you are faced with disruption, and believe me, as I work across a whole range of different industries, there's probably not one industry that isn't worried about the power of technology, in particular, digital technology, to actually disrupt their existing competitive landscape. So everybody's worried about the Amazon of, creating a platform and interposing themselves between themselves and the end consumer, for example. So that's an example of technological disruption. And of course, we've just been witnessing in the last few months another major disruption caused by the pandemic. And as many people have said, that disruption is one of those things that we're going to have to learn to live with. But it does actually really focus on, okay, well, how do you respond, particularly if you're an established company, to the threat of disruption? And I guess really the only thing you can do is to constantly reinvent yourself. As you can see there on the slide, reinvent is one of the responses to that. And if you look at companies that have been around a long time, you see that they have typically reinvented themselves several times over the course of their history. Now, most of us in business, we don't have the luxury of just stopping doing the old stuff and starting doing something completely different. We have shareholders, we have employees, we have other stakeholders that we have to satisfy. So it means that we have to continue doing the stuff that we are known for, our core business, as well as working out what we're going to do in the future. And that's really the essence of this term ambidexterity. So ambidexterity, if you should turn to the next slide. So I guess most of us know, this concept from, personality. The idea of an ambidextrous person is somebody who is equally capable of writing or working with both their left and their right hand. And by extension, thinkers in organizational studies have used this to apply to organizations that are equally adept at both exploit. You'll see me doing this a lot during the call, and explore, right? So the notion of exploit and explore is core to what we mean by organizational ambidexterity. So what do these concepts mean? If you turn to the next slide, Marieluise, we'll just unpack them a little bit.
Bear with me.
Yep, no problem. Yeah, here we go. So exploit and explore. So exploit, which is what a lot of us spend most of our time doing, is really about what you should be focusing on within your core business. And it's about actually how you can run an effective and successful business, meet your targets, meet the expectations of your stakeholders. So as it says here, establishing clear processes. So clear processes really is where you try to incorporate your learning that you've got into producing something that's very efficient. Optimizing the structure, making sure that you have the right structure for delivering. leveraging core competencies. Where have you heard that before? So making sure that you know what you do and you're able to capitalize on all that learning that's gone before. And it means really valuing highly efficiency, so things like economies of scale, making sure that you can operate effectively, consistently. So often there's a focus on quality, total quality management, lean, all those other good things that companies have been working on in order to actually make them as efficient as possible. And as it says here, this is an interesting concept here, variance reduction. And anybody that's involved at all in lean or production technology knows what we mean by that. You actually want to limit the variance in what you're doing. Now in explore, on the other hand, you want to actually increase the variance, because if you increase the variance in an area where you're not really sure what the end solution is, you're more likely to come up with a creative solution. So if we move to the explore side, you can see that's actually a very different mode of operation. So if exploit works in the core, explore works really at the edge. So it's where you're starting to move into areas where you really don't know what the end solution is going to be. You're not quite sure. Maybe even your customers aren't sure either, because this thing has not existed before. So you have to be much more entrepreneurial. You have to adapt. And so things like the lean startup methodology is very, very helpful here, where you develop a minimum viable product and then you iterate based upon the feedback you're getting from the marketplace. Learning from failure, really critical difference here. So if you're in exploit mode, you actually want to minimize the amount of mistakes, right? So if you're running an airline, you don't want to have a lot of failures, right? You want to minimize those failures, right? You don't want the pilot deciding that they're going to try a new route across the Atlantic or whatever. You've got to kind of minimize those mistakes that you have. But if you're in explore mode, you've got to accept that failure is going to come with the package, right? As you try new stuff, not everything will work. And the key here is, how can you learn from those failures, and how can you make sure that that's institutionalized? And you're really driving here for step changes in innovation. So new business models, for example. Exploit, you can still innovate, but it tends to be more incremental innovation. Innovations around processes. Whereas explore, you're often looking at how we can develop completely new businesses or new business models. And of course, the key here is that in addition, in contrast to exploit, whether the focus is much more on consistency, here you're looking much more at adaptability and the ability to experiment. So there you can see, I'll do it again, those two things, exploit and explore. And what brings them together is ambidexterity, and in particular, as we'll discover, ambidextrous leadership, the ability to actually move between these two different modes within an organization. Okay, so I think you'll agree, this is pretty easy stuff, right? Everybody's got this, right? But here's the hard bit. How do you actually put it into action? Marieluise, what do you think?
Absolutely. So it's one of those concepts that you get fairly quickly, but doing it is really tricky. And so let's talk about why companies find it so tricky. As Ian said, with his two hands, the two mindsets are fundamentally opposite. One tries to cement the status quo. The other is geared to destroy it, really. And this is why some companies have used different colors to separate them out. So blue in our presentation will be the symbol for stability, for exploitation, and green, like nature, is change. It's evolvement. And so the big problem with achieving ambidexterity is the drive for short-term gains. In the office, we used to have a saying that goes, exploit will eat explore for breakfast every time, because all the companies we work in are kind of geared towards our exploit kind of world. This is where our KPIs are, our targets, our measures. And so this is where sort of the daily business tends to pull us back into. therefore we spend a lot of time in it. And so while organizational ambidexterity is easy to understand, as Ian has just really nicely kind of demonstrated to us, it's really hard to achieve in real life. And if you think about those people who are truly ambidextrous, who can use their right hand and their left hand equally to draw or write, they're only about 1% in the general population. And I think we argue it's similarly tricky for business to get to that equal kind of measure for both hands. So let's look at how businesses can get there, what avenues are open to them. And there are 3 different ways to achieve ambidexterity in an organization. The first one is sequential ambidexterity. And as you can see from my little pendulum, it means swinging from one side to the other, from exploit to explore and back. And so there's 2 scenarios that are really rather common in this. The first one is your startup that matures. Startups tend to emphasize growth in the beginning at the expense of operational discipline. When they are in their kind of new product phase, trying to figure out what the product is, what the market is, what the customers are, what services they want to offer, they are in the core explore territory. This is where you're seeing your little squiggles. However, once that is established, they need to build the internal efficiencies, so the exploit capabilities. The danger is that in this phase, the CEOs who've been great in the explore, kind of try things out, fail, learn, iterate, MVPs, get it out there to customers, try it, are in many cases not the people who are great at execution and streamlining and putting in rules and procedures. And so at this point, you very often get a COO to take over and sort of streamline and bring that together. So that's the first scenario. That's the swing from explore to exploit. Let's look at the second scenario. And this is a bit our COVID-19, our crisis scenario. And I wonder if you can find yourself in this. So the crisis of the established organization. Most established organizations spend their daily business more in the exploitation. This is where you're making money in, through squeezing the margins and getting better and better and better at your daily business. And that's what you're doing. And you're seeing my little accountant, they're getting better and better and better at what he's doing. Until the crisis hit, so COVID-19, and so processes that were well established and optimized suddenly are thrown into that explore territory, because we're all working from home, we're finding ways to sell virtually or deal with our customers and clients virtually, we're having to lead by conference call, or in our case, train through this medium of webinars. And so everything you knew that was well in the kind of exploit bucket, your daily business, suddenly gets shifted into explore because of that crisis. However, crisis, we're coming out, we're kind of stabilizing again in what a lot of people call this new normal. And so we're going back into the exploit mode. And the question I have a lot of my clients ask right now is, as we're swinging back, how can we keep this experimenting mindset, this idea of 80% really being enough and not having to be 120% with everything we do, and the speed that they have established, and the willingness for things not to be perfect? How do we keep that alive? All these explore phenomena as we shift back into a more exploit world.
Yeah.
Just a question.
And that's the thing. I think we can explore that a little later on the call as well.
Absolutely. So that was number one, sequential ambidexterity, the sequence you're swinging back and forth. Let's look at structural ambidexterity, the second approach. And this is designing ambidexterity into your organizational structures, hence structural ambidexterity. In this approach, you kind of separate out your explore and your exploit activities into different teams, different departments, different parts of the organization. And they only come together at this very top of the organization. So you see our leader kind of holding the blue and the green together. And this approach can work, especially in times of stability. So one example that we've seen where it has worked is if you've got, what's often called skunk work teams. Yep. So teams that are really out there just to get the innovation going. They often tend to sit in Silicon Valley because that's where they all kind of gather. And you might have your management team sitting in Ohio, you've got your skunk works innovators sitting in Silicon Valley, and then your production guys in Kansas. And so you've got, management up there at the top, distant from the other two. And it's relatively straightforward to implement. But it has a couple of issues that it brings with it, because what happens is your salespeople from the field, their information doesn't get fed back to the innovators because they're all so separate and in different locations. The same goes from the guys who are sitting in production, because remember, they're in Kansas, the others are in Silicon Valley. And so you're not getting that information from what your clients want, what production can do, and that bridge is just not there. Collaboration isn't there, knowledge sharing, resource sharing across the firm isn't established. And so the innovation team doesn't really benefit from the insights of the established company experts and the links to the existing clients. And this can result in very moderate innovation products getting to market, because that truly transformative idea doesn't survive those bridges out to the production guys or to the sales guys.
I think there's a really important point there, Marieluise, and I think one of the things that we want to get across, I think, in this talk is really important that exploit and explore work closely together in order to actually generate value. And almost one of the key messages here is that if you're mostly in exploit, you've got to appreciate the people in explore. And if you're mostly spending most of your time in an explore mode, you've also got to respect the people that are in exploit. Because to be a successful company, you need to do both of those things, right? Exploit needs explore as much as explore needs exploit.
Absolutely. So it's rather than the hands doing that, is they should be coming together. And so and I think that the last danger, just to finish up on my structural ambidexterity, is that danger of the innovators, that little innovative cell. If times get tough, they can get sold off as an independent asset, and you've lost that ability. So we're coming to the silver bullet of ambidextrous organizations, and as Ian said, it's our kind of stripy leader, the contextual ambidexterity. And this needs a more agile organization, because whether you're an individual or a team, you need to choose the context in which you are blue or green, hence contextual ambidexterity. So when are you creative and innovative, and when are you kind of cost saving and looking at exploitative behaviors? It depends on your context. And so ideally, you'd have the entire firm, from the C-suite down to the production line, being able to kind of go into either mode when it is being called for. And contextual ambidexterity, it calls for a really well-skilled and flexible leader, because they need to hold that dichotomy of explore and exploit. Remember the previous slide saying that they're really, really different and they're pushing towards different ends of the spectrum. So holding this dichotomy is really quite an ask.
I think so, right. Maybe I just to add there, I think that it is a big ask to be perfectly ambidextrous as a leader. And I don't think there are many that are like that. But I would say that as you get more senior in the organization, then the demands on you are actually to be much more ambidextrous. I think you can get away with being more exploit or more explore lower down in your career. But as you become more senior, often your entire working day is filled with episodes where you're moving from one to the other, 20 minutes in one and 20 minutes in another, and you literally have to change your vocabulary and your mindset as you shift from one to the other.
And it's really helpful if you're leading a team to have that vocabulary of ambidexterity, so they know why you're addressing them in either mode at any point in time. And so while we've looked at organizational ambidexterity for the last couple of slides, let's go back and Ian, I think you're diving deeper into this.
Yeah, I'm going to dive into this.
Organizational ambidexterity. Here we go.
Here we go. So where would we be without a 2x2 matrix, right? I mean, you've got to have one, haven't you, really? So here we have down the vertical axis, we have exploit. Along the horizontal one, we have explore. Obviously, we have 4 positions. So ideally, you want to be high, right? Everybody wants to be high. At the moment, I guess many people would say companies like Amazon and Microsoft seem to have pulled that off. However, interestingly, going back to Marieluise's point about sequential ambidexterity, I think they got there from a different position. So Microsoft for a long time was in that high exploit, low explore segment, the top left, basically because they had a kind of a quasi monopoly through their Windows and Microsoft Office. And it's only really in the last, I suppose 5 to 10 years or so that they've moved now much more to the right, starting to innovate much more, particularly around the use of AI. And similarly, Amazon, I think for a long time was down at the bottom right. They were very high in explore, but not so high in exploit. But now they've moved into things like Amazon Web Services, of course, which means that they've got a really great core, which is working very efficiently, which also then enables them to continue to explore and to launch new verticals. So there is, it were, the sort of the paragons of this. You could think of companies in that top left. Often those are companies that are monopolies in some ways. They enjoy some kind of protection either through patents or whatever, and therefore they don't necessarily have to explore. The pressure's not on them to explore as much as it is for others. And then down in the bottom right, you've got companies like Philips. Historically, Philips has been really good at innovating and coming up with new concepts, but not so good at actually commercializing them. In fact, in many of the cases, they were the originators, the first into the market, but they weren't the ones that actually established the dominant standard. And that's something I think which is maybe culturally embedded in them. And then you've got companies that are sadly in the low. Often that comes about, as we see here, these 2 examples of companies that were previously actually in a position to defend their position in the marketplace, but technology or the competitive landscape has moved so quickly that it's destroyed that advantage, and it's left them neither with the ability to exploit nor with the ability to explore effectively. And that, of course, is definitely a danger zone. So with that in mind, we're going to ask you a question here. So if you think about your company and where it is now, where would you position it? If you think you're great, you are perfectly ambidextrous like Amazon and Microsoft, you can go in the top right hand. That's, oh, by the way, here we go, we'll go through this. So quadrant 1, this is where you're in the BlackBerry and Nokia, erstwhile. Quadrant 2, low explore, high exploit. So that's where you're in the monopoly position. Quadrant 3, high explore, low exploit. That's the kind of the Philips position. And then finally, quadrant 4, high explore, high exploit. That's the sort of the Amazon and Microsoft position. So make your choice and let's see where people are. What's your best get, Marieluise?
I'm quite interested. I don't know. I'm not sure who we have on this call. It's hard to get. Normally, if we work with a particular company, you can better guess.
I would say what's interesting to me is I think that ordinarily when you would do this, you tend to get a lot of quadrants 2, so low explore, high exploits.
Mm.
But I think maybe now, as you were saying earlier, because of the COVID, you might have several that have been plunged into the high explore.
Mm. Because of the times we live in, hey?
Yeah.
How's it going, Desiree? Are we getting results in? Ah.
Yeah. Okay, low explore, high exploit. Still, it has the highest. Yep. Okay. High explore and low exploit 33. That's very interesting, isn't it? And then high exploit. Okay, good. Well, here the good news there, I think, is that we don't have anybody who thinks they're in low explore and low exploit. So that's good. So it means probably that your monthly paycheck is safe for a while at least. I would say the low explore, high exploit. That's also a danger zone, but typically that's not an immediate danger zone. That's a danger zone either in the sort of medium to longer term, or if there is a major disruption in your business that can happen more quickly, but tends not to be the most immediate problem. If you have low exploit, then that could mean that you are not going to be able to meet your existing short-term commitments and targets, which could be problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. Ian, are you okay for me to go back to leadership ambidexterity?
Yeah, I think this is a good point actually to do that, because I mean, clearly we can all recognize where our company is on this continuum, but at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is what can we as leaders do in order to improve that situation. So help us out with that.
Absolutely. So as you can see from this table, the leadership behaviors in the different modes are very different. And we've been talking about this all along. And so this idea of being consistently inconsistent, Ian was talking about your 20-minute slots here or there. So signaling to somebody that you are behaving the way you're behaving because you are in exploit or you are in explore. So let's see how you can adapt your leadership style. In exploit, you want to use what's called sort of closing behaviors. Behaviors that promote alignment, focus, and avoid change, because you really want to increase stability. You want to give clear direction, and you're really trying to avoid conflict because there is a clear way to solve things. Cautious, you're not very keen on risk, and you're really trying to meet your targets, your metrics, your rules, which is why this is easier to measure, to give you targets, and to kind of strive for. You know what you're doing. This is your core business, and you're trying to get more and more out of those margins.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think the other thing is just to remember here, a lot of people ask us, does that mean there's no innovation in exploit? There is innovation in exploit, but it's not quite the same as in explore, right? Innovation in exploit really is more about incremental innovation. It's more about process innovation, practice innovation. It's innovation which is typically small in terms of each individual thing that you're doing, but cumulatively could actually be very, very important indeed, and could make the difference, particularly in a lot of industries that may be more basic and more capital intensive.
Yeah, because what we'll be looking at the industries, it really depends which industry you're in, which role you're in, where you are in the organization, and we'll come to that when we talk about you a little later on. So in Explore, you can see it's all about opening behaviors. It's the opposite. So you want to promote adaptation. So you want variety, freedom to create. You want to really encourage change and increase that variation across. It's about the flexibility to experiment, and you need to be okay with conflict, because out of that tension comes something new. And the really big organizational challenge, you need to allow for failure, because as you're trying things and you're doing this kind of big experimentation, big innovation, things will go wrong because you don't know where you are. And it's really important at this point that you extract the learning. And so it's about nonlinear thinking, it's about entrepreneurial spirit, and it's a really tall order for any leader to kind of be able to hold these two very different modes. And this is why we're coming to the next slide. Oh, yeah, sorry about that. I think, yeah, here we go. While it's the gold standard for an ambidextrous leader to shift effortlessly from one side to the other and just be this kind of inconsistently consistent leader, very often in real life, we see that we have teams at the top who complete each other. So one of those examples would be Steve Jobs and Tim Cook. And I think most people would agree with me when I say that Steve Jobs is known to be highly innovative. He pushed the boundaries on all his products, but he didn't really like things like supply chain and budgets and the more kind of core business processes that you need to stabilize. And this is
actually, Marilyn, I think if you look back through business history, you can see multiple examples of this. Very successful companies that have these pairs of people at the top, recognizing that you do need these two approaches to be successful, an explore approach and an exploit approach. And so if you think of the Ford Motor Company in the 1920s, they had Henry Ford, but they also had a guy called Sorensen. Those of the UK audience might remember the most successful company in the 80s and 90s in the UK was Hanson. Hanson basically had two people at the top, Lord Hanson and Lord White. One was very much a deal maker, always pushing the boundaries of the organization out, looking to do new things. The other one was very much about how do you manage the business, how do you extract the value from that. And that, if you have that combination, and if the two have mutual respect and can work effectively with one another, then you have actually quite a powerful combination.
Yeah, so absolutely. So we're coming to this point where, and I think Ian, you'll remember we had a client where sort of that minimum requirement was that the explorers and the exploiters would work together, because you have very often people who are in explore looking at the exploiters and thinking, well, they might be a little dull, they're sort of, you know, stuck in their ways. On the other hand, you've got exploiters who look at the explorers going as, well, they're wasting all the money we've just made with all these experiments they're running that are not leading to anything. And so, as Ian said, I think the minimum standard is that mutual kind of respect and understanding that each one of those two sides is critical to business success, and we can't live one or the other. So, up. I think that was one too many. Let's talk about you. We've looked at you know famous examples throughout corporate history, but let's look at you. If there was a scale, a spectrum that had one end 100% explore, so you feel most at home while you innovate, while you create, you're happy to disrupt existing processes and business models, you're really happy to kind of test, retest, accept failure, you're looking for novel ideas and how to improve quality and lower costs through kind of big step changes, and you're regularly looking for new clients in the markets, even if you don't quite know how your products will fit their needs. That's position 5 on this graph. On the very kind of opposite end of that, you've got people who are mostly familiar and love the exploit world. So you're working in known processes, in known rules and regulations. You're upholding existing methods, standards, and products. You're sticking to what is known and what is well tested. You're introducing, as Ian said, improvements to existing products and services, but they're sort of smaller incremental changes. And you're looking at really finding more and more economies of scale in the existing markets and how to lower your costs of the existing processes and products. That's position 1. So you have that kind of spectrum across. In between, you've got our very kind of happy medium. You're equally happy in either one of the modes. And then you've got position 2 and 4. One is a bit more explore than exploit, and the other one is a bit more exploit than explore. Right now, let's not consider COVID-19, but in your daily work up until now, for the last, say, year or something, where do you see your own preference? Where do you fit? And I think Desiree is bringing up a second poll for this. Exactly. Tell us your own preference. Where do you spend most of your time? What's your role asking of you? Ian, what are you? Where are you most happy in?
Where am I most happy in? I am, yeah, I would say I'm probably something like a 4. So I like to, I'm not a pure innovator. I like to take existing stuff and modify and incorporate. I can usually see how to do that very effectively.
Yeah, I really love innovation, but I find it can get a bit tiring over times if you have to kind of reinvent all the time. So I love the excitement of the new, but yes, I think I'm with you that a bit of, you know, common process and, you know, drawing on what's known is quite comforting to me too. Let's see where our participants are. And I know Desiree is working hard behind the scenes to make that happen for us. Thank you, Desiree. Okay, we've got a lot of, look at that. Half the people are kind of happy in between. That's
very good.
Quite astonishing. So we've got that golden bullet of or silver bullet of a leader here. Half exploit, half explore.
So maybe that's because maybe we've attracted those particular people to our webinar. Maybe that skewed the results a little bit. I would say, you know, when we've done this type of thing before in other contexts, the pattern is that people tend to spend most of their time disproportionately in exploit. You'll get a few people who, you know, whose role is around innovation, new product development, or whatever, who are used to spending more of their time in explore. But in general, most of us, you know, as you were saying earlier, because of the organizational constraint on us, you know, you've got to deliver, you've got to get stuff done, you know, you've got targets to meet. That tends to force us more and more into exploit. And so I think most of the frustrations that I perceive is that people often want to do more explore than they can or feel they can do.
Yeah, and I would agree. It completely depends on where you are in the organization. So we find that more junior roles are often a bit more sort of administrative and more on the exploit spectrum. Which team you're in, sort of which function. So of course, if you're R&D, that's very different than if you're upholding, you know, kind of accounting, the finance department sort of thing. So where you are and which industry you're in. So tech is known to be really exploitative, whereby, Ian, you've mentioned, I think, a cement client earlier, and they're more on this kind of standard upholding what we know. So for the personal reflection, I think we might just talk about it rather than do it in the interest of time. So if you can am I back in? You can take me to the next slide, Desiree. One before that, I think. Oh, okay, sorry, that was, yes. So for you, just to reflect on, rather than for us to run the poll right now, in the interest of time, think about, there is where your role sits versus where your own preference is. And I'll tell you a quick story about myself. So I found myself in a role that asked a lot of kind of systems updating, chasing money, very kind of standard day-to-day processing. Oh, I'm having a bit of an echo there. Okay.
Yeah.
And so I actually stepped out of that role and became independent because I wanted to change how I spent my days. And that match between role and my preference didn't overlap at all. So up. On the personal reflection side, if you find that your preference doesn't match your role, there are two ways. You can either stretch yourself into that area, if you find that that's something that might build your career or something that you should be learning because it's really helpful, or change your role and figure out how your role can better fit your natural tendencies, and think of Steve Jobs and bring in, you know, Tim Cook to kind of complement you. If you're leading people or you're in an HR capacity and you're supporting people, it's really helpful, I think, to think about how well do their natural preferences match their role. And if there is a mismatch, what can you do as a leader or as an HR or L&D professional to help them either grow into it or change the role so that they feel more comfortable? And as you heard at the beginning, exploit eats explore for breakfast. So we find that many people in organizations are spending or feel that they spend too little time in their explore activities. They feel like this is really where they should, especially as leaders, kind of step up and do more, but they don't find the time or the impulse because the daily business kind of sucks them back into their exploit business through the KPIs and everything we've talked about. So what can you do to spend more time in explore and to make that shift happen? And those are just a couple of personal reflection questions I'd love to kind of leave you with for after the webinar. And Ian, you're now talking about crisis.
Let's talk about the crisis, because I think that ambidexterity has also come under quite a lot of strain during this crisis. So, as Marieluise was saying earlier on, you know, that a lot of people have had to explore new ways of doing things during the crisis. So, you know, the example that she gave, you know, a lot of educational institutions going online, and that's great. And I think a lot of that has been very useful experimentation. We've learned a lot, and probably a lot of that will be institutionalized subsequently. But I also see what I call here the shadow side, almost like the pathology of ambidexterity. So you can get a situation where instead of pure explore, it kind of becomes firefighting, crisis management. So you find that the management spends all their time really reacting to events, you know, whack-a-mole. So when something comes up, you know, you whack it down. And then there's a tendency as a result of that to neglect things like process consistency. This is a core exploit value, which is really helpful to the organization. But if you just say, oh, well, never mind the process, just solve the problem, you end up actually maybe getting a short-term solution, but actually it's not something which is ultimately sustainable. And you find that managers then running around doing one thing after another. There's quite a lot of chaos. Paradoxically, it probably feels quite good. But a lot of managers actually enjoy that kind of firefighting mode because there's a lot of adrenaline. They feel like they're the ones that are solving the problems. They become fixers rather than leaders in this process. And it does quite a lot of good for your ego because you feel like you're making a lot of progress in that. but actually ultimately it becomes a kind of a pathology, because what you really want to do, of course, is to make sure that you have a sustainable approach to this. You want more explore and less crisis management. And then of course the question comes, what happens after the crisis? Now I guess that broadly speaking, your organizations will fall on a spectrum. There will be those that have come out of the crisis extremely well. You could call them the winners in this crisis. So if you come from a pharmaceutical company or one of the big tech companies, or maybe you are from a small startup that's suddenly been pushed into prominence, you'll be in a very strong position. And then the danger there, of course, is that nothing fails like success. And so because you've been so successful, you'll find it then very difficult to change the way that you do things. If you're not, then you might also find that difficult to change, because the focus will be on survival and on cash flow and all those other good things. So the thing to avoid is that instead of exploit, which I always think is that exploit really is a very effective mode of operation, at least in the short term. Instead of that, you get a kind of a business as usual stagnation. You just focus on delivering results in the short term. You hear people say things like, well, if only we had the resources to do such and such. And then you get sucked into this notion of path dependence. What you do in the future is really a product of what you've done in the past. And that sucks you down a particular role. And some people call these, for example, competency traps, because you are very good. The old thing is, if you have a very good hammer, everything you see looks like a nail, so you bash it. You spend all your time bashing things with the hammer instead of thinking of other ways of doing things. So I would say that the real danger there is that the leader becomes a kind of a manager and lacks the ability to continue to challenge the status quo. And so as we think of those two situations in the crisis, I think the challenge is for the organization to innovate and explore in a systematic way. What can help there? I think for sure an overriding sense of purpose. Some people use the expression commander's intent, other people talk about the North Star. If you have a really clear purpose in the organization, that can actually help you target your explore efforts, and it also can help you to systematize the learning that you're getting from that. That's very helpful. And I think in the after the crisis, what you really need to do is to ensure that the organization doesn't sink back into business as usual, but continues to challenge the status quo. Because if you're not, the danger is that there will be some other organization. That brings us back really to where we came in at the start of all this, which was this notion of disruption. And you are at your peak risk of disruption when you're feeling really pleased with yourself, you feel like you're successful, the results look good, but there's always somebody looking over your shoulder. And in many cases, those will be tech companies that have very powerful data capabilities that may be targeting attractive verticals. So it's important to continue to keep thinking about ways in which you can push the explore boundary. So maybe that's a discussion that we should try and take now. So if the challenge then is to continue to explore when we get back to normal and maintain the momentum to continuously reinvent, how are you as leaders, how are you going to do that? What things can you do? Because I think that one of the things we have to avoid is, oh, well, it's always them up there. It's to do with the chief exec. And to some extent it is, but actually everybody in an organization can contribute to this. We're all leaders. We all have the ability to think about how we prioritize our time. So let us know in the chat what your thoughts are on this. How can I as a leader promote more explore behaviors in this new normal that Marieluise talked about, and maintain the momentum within the organization to continuously reinvent and not to fall back into business as usual? Let's see if we can get some ideas on that. So if you can put the
question box, just to be very clear, the question box we'd like you to use for that.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Desiree, maybe we can have some of your help there as well in monitoring that.
Brilliant.
Ooh, Ian, we've got quite a few questions. Let's see. How do I? Those are questions for later on, I think.
Yeah, we've got some great Joseph Joe Presturi, my man. Good to hear from Joe. We use a structured approach, but have okay, great. I'm looking forward to addressing these questions. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Shall we go to the Q&A then, Ian? I think why not?
Yeah. Why not?
So up. Let me get one further. I think Desiree, you and I are having a fight over who controls the slide.
So we take the first one.
To do my keyboard.
Here we go. Very good. Ian, pick a question and go for it.
How can we? So really good one from Joe Pastrui. How can we approach ambidexterity without it being a response to an outside event? In other words, how can it be a matter of practice? Well, I guess one approach is the approach that we're doing now, really, which is you can train people. I think the more people get used to exercising that particular muscle and thinking about these two different modes of operation in an organization, the better it's going to be. I do think, though, to just challenge the premise of the question, it's actually quite helpful to have an outside event from time to time to actually remind us that all organizations, all sectors are ultimately susceptible to disruption. I'm sure, Joe, you find that as well. A lot of the clients that you're dealing with will be struggling with this. So that actually provides a very powerful, compelling rationale, I think, for thinking about this in this way. And
go ahead.
And I think the other thing I would say is, I think the more you get top leaders in the organization talking about this, the more effective it is. So in one very large German tech company that we will work with, the CEO championed the approach. He took his entire management team to Stanford, and they did I think it was a 2-week course on ambidexterity. So by the time they came back, everybody was for and doing great.
Yeah, and I think that ties in with the questions that both Imke and Thiago kind of asked. They're similar, and that is basically, how do I get this content into a leadership development program, or how do I get it in my organization as a learning culture? And I think, Ian, as you said, one of the first steps is just to get this concept out there, so people have the language to say, I want to make time for explore. Or I'm having this team meeting be an explore meeting, so let's open up, whereby the next one is very clearly exploit. And so I will try to kind of close down conversations in order to drive us to get to those efficiencies. Ian, what else have we done in learning programs? We've done cases where people kind of travel through an organization that has different developmental stages that demand different behaviors from leaders, and so participants kind of work through where they are.
All type of exercise that we do with them. Observing behaviors. I think that's cool. I think that's okay. I think anything that brings it, makes it practical, makes it applied, and actually shows them that it's not just words, it's also about behaviors. People, I think, act according to demonstrable, visible behaviors in leaders, and they see that they're making decisions or acting in certain ways, then they'll adjust their behaviors accordingly. So I think it's important that it comes down to that behavioral level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm finding that participants find it really helpful to talk to one another about, how are you leading? We've had participants kind of pair up in different parts of the organization. And what that led to is, I remember somebody being in a really kind of wild explore kind of function, spending time with a leader in the exploit function, becoming really grateful to the money they generate in order to have these guys go wild on their ideas, and becoming sort of more mindful of how they spend the money here, because it's quite tough to get over here. Yeah, there's a multitude of ways to establish this in an organization.
I want to make sure that I'm addressing as many as possible. So Lois Lamar says, why would a business with a monopoly position move to an ambidextrous organization? Well, typically because the monopoly position either comes to an end or it's likely that it will. So for example, in the pharmaceutical industry, monopoly position defines, your position. If you come up with a new drug, it's patented, the life of the patent comes to an end, and then competition then increases. And similar with other things. If you've been the first in, or you've dominated a particular market space for a long time, then you'll tend then to operate on a much more of an exploit basis. Venkatraman, thanks for your thing there. We use the structural approach, and I'm not saying that we're not saying that structural approach is wrong. It can work, but you do. I mean, what you're saying here is that you have a very, very well thought out structure for making sure that the explore is actually filtered into the exploit, and vice versa. And also making sure that there's interchange between those teams. That's great. I think it can work, but you do have to put a lot of effort into that.
And then Venki Tamaran comes back and asks us later, how have we measured, or what are the measures to figure out if where someone is in that 2x2 matrix? It's the level of innovation, I would say, on one side. So how many new products that are really disrupting the market are coming out, and then how good are they at kind of reducing costs and stabilizing that service in the way they service customers, in the way they deal with very normal processes that even you as a customer can experience.
Absolutely. And just on this, so I want to emphasize this in particular, because people tend to find explore the sexiest part of the ambidextrous thing, right? And so we want to be very innovative. Yeah, absolutely, we do. But there's a lot you can do within exploit, and a well-run company should also focus on how we can improve our operations. So if you haven't read a book, for example, like Matthew Syed's Black Box Thinking, which contrasts what's happened over time in the airline industry with the medical or healthcare industry, and the huge reduction in fatalities in the airline industry, which is really a function of systematic learning, capturing data, and then making improvements, which over time really make it safer and much more efficient. Whereas in the healthcare industry, they didn't have that compulsion, that compelling focus on improving their efficiency in operations. So there's a lot you can do within that, and I think that's that's an integral part really of ambidexterity.
And we are coming to the end of our hour. Exactly.
Wow.
So I just want to call out that people are still sending us ideas of how to kind of shift and keep things going. We've heard from Thiago, who says, listen more. And Roberto says annual objectives are great to move people into explore. And so there's been a good discussion. And so thank you for your questions. And it's been a really, really good talk. Desiree.
Yeah, but this was so interesting. Unfortunately, as you can see, we are running out of time. So a huge thank you, Ian and Marie-Louise, for this time. Very interesting, and I think you did such a good job at explaining what I think some people thought is quite a complex topic. But I think it's clear to everyone now what ambidexterity is truly about. If you haven't already, Please sign up for our newsletters where you can find out more about future webinars. If you have any questions, go to marketing@headspringexecutive.com, or you can go to our contact us page at headspringexecutive.com. That's all from me, and thank you again so much. This was really, really interesting.
Thank you, guys.
Thank
Have
you.
a good day, everyone.
Have
Bye.
a lovely day. Bye-bye.